Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Today, we're going to be continuing on from our 6.8 discussion of the origins of progressivism, and today looking at progressive presidents and policies, in particular, those of Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. As we laid out for the last lesson, you have to think about Unit 6 as two parts. The first part, 1865 to 1900, that Gilded Age, unrestricted and restrained laissez-faire capitalism, and the rise of urbanization, increased immigration, and it created issues, some of them foreseen and others unforeseen. But the progressive era is ultimately going to be the period of time from the 1890s through 1920 in which people attempt to address those issues. And I'm going to start with a political cartoon here based off of our last discussion. But we want to make sure that we understand how to put together what will be the public outcry to issues like meat packing. This is in reference to Upton Sinclair revealing in the jungle how meat was processed in places like Chicago. And then also understanding that now there is going to be a government response to this. And we can see that in the figure here of Theodore Roosevelt, who is holding what is actually a rake covered in muck. So those muck rakers, we get that reference there. And this one says investigation. And if we notice in the background, we've got a Capitol building far in the distance. So one would think if you're going to have any regulation, legislation, administrative law, it would be originating from the Capitol, from the legislative branch. But in fact, it did turn out that early on, at least at the national level, it was presidents, it was figures like Teddy Roosevelt who are going to make sure that something is done. So, in light of the public outcry over the jungle and what it revealed, Theodore Roosevelt commissioned an investigation and then had that investigation's findings dropped on the doorstep of the Capitol building for them to be able then to do something about it. And our cartoonist says it's a nauseating job, but something must be done. And two images here, you will find that Theodore Roosevelt is one of the most caricatured presidents. We certainly saw that earlier with Lincoln and Jackson. And then we have other figures like Boss Tweed who often figure on the AP examination. So I thought it was a good place to be able to examine what would make TR so easily drawn and recognizable. And part of that being the fabulous stash. If you look, he's got that pince nez, which is essentially a set of glasses without temples. He could literally take that off and put it in his pocket. He had terrible eyesight and required those throughout his life. He also is a cultural icon beyond the presidency. So he was an avid hunter and conservationist. And the story is that he was out on a bear hunt and one of his party accidentally killed a mother bear. And they found that she had cubs. And the decision was made by the others that maybe they should just shoot the cubs as well. And TR said that was cruel. He picked up one of the cubs. An enterprising photographer took a picture of it. It gets labeled Teddy's bear. And we see that within weeks, you will have toy makers creating a teddy bear. So if you ever kind of wondered where the origins of that came from, it is from that guy. And you can see in our political cartoons here, these are all in reference to the anthracite coal strike in 1902, but we can see not only the pince-nez and his mustache, but he also was a very frenetic and energetic man. He became president at age 36. He inherited that space when the president, William McKinley, was assassinated in 1901. So he is just a figure much like Lincoln and Jackson, that they had some very specific physical characteristics. And then certainly as they extended the executive branch in terms of its power, and that's why we're going to spend some time focused on people like TR today, you can see that he makes him good fodder for political cartooning. So Theodore Roosevelt is elevated to the presidency in 1901, and he says he's going to create a square deal for the American people. And square in this sense means to make right. He sees that there are problems. He had had a progressive mindset really all of his life. He came from a very wealthy family. The last name Roosevelt is a Dutch name. His family arrived in the early 1600s, owned land in New York State. And so he was Harvard educated. There was no expectation that he was going to be destitute. He did write for a living and provide for his family that way. But he came from money and means and believed that he had a responsibility to serve the public. First, as a member of the New York State Legislature, he was also the police commissioner of New York City and really transformed policing not only in that city but across the country. He was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He went and fought in the Spanish American War and found himself as governor of New York out of the celebration of his bravery there. And by 1901, president of the United States. Early on, he was having to face a coal strike. And there have been other strikes. We've looked at them in previous lessons. And the big ones like Homestead, Haymarket, Pullman, often came to a place where there would be some kind of government intervention. The governor would send in some type of, National Guard, or in the case of the Pullman strike, you have Grover Cleveland sending in the military. In all of those cases, though, it ultimately is the government intervening on the side of the owners, not the workers. And TR recognized that with the coal strike of 1902, and he certainly had read the muckraking literature of the time, he knew that these mines were full of workers who were grossly underpaid. Children were working in them, and felt that they had legitimate cause to ask for more money. And when they didn't get it, legitimate cause to strike. But he didn't want this to continue on and on. They were approaching the winter months. Coal was needed to heat people's homes. It was moving the trains. It was a necessary fuel. So this couldn't go on for any prolonged period of time. So as a president, taking on a role that hadn't been done before, he assigned a representative to the coal miners. He brought in the owners and had them come to the White House and said they had to come to an agreement, basically encouraging this idea that there was legitimacy into what the workers were asking for, and that the workers were not going to be prosecuted for the strike, but also an expectation that the workers, if they got an increase to their wages, it wouldn't be such that it would ultimately ruin the company, but that they could work together. So the process we have since the 1930s with the National Labor Relations Board and arbitration between management and unions, we see this for the first time being unveiled and utilized by Theodore Roosevelt. He also was a trust buster. He was going to bust up some trusts, and the first one that his administration goes after is one of J.P. Morgan's, called Northern Securities. It was a railroad company out in the West. They brought 43 charges against the company for all kinds of practices, including things like pooling, that had long ago been said to be not legal. But JP Morgan countersued, believing that if he brought his case to the Supreme Court, he would be able to file for harassment. He'd be able to simply say that the charges were not enforceable. And unfortunately for JP Morgan, the Supreme Court felt differently. So it will be the first of what will become many trusts and monopolies that'll begin to be broken up in this period. Out of this comes something called the Hepburn Act. Congress will go and create a set of administrative laws for regulating interstate railroads. So although there had been the Wabash case back in 1886, the creation of the Interstate Commerce Commission in 1887, it didn't really have teeth. They didn't really have many laws to enforce, and it really had to be that the egregious activity happened. There was sort of no preventative measures at all. And so the Hepburn Act is going to clarify what exactly are the ways in which these interstate railroads can do their business. The other thing that was part of the square deal was consumer protection. Again, the jungle, that reference to that cartoon we just saw a couple of slides ago. The outcry was not only about the fact that we have mass produced food and in obviously unsanitary conditions, but food as a whole was unlabeled. You could call something juice and it actually have very little actual fruit juice in it. You could use all kinds of chemicals, things like cadmium and cobalt ended up being used as in dyes for foods, especially candies. These are all very dangerous for people to ingest in any large quantity. So the labeling you see on packaged food today, that comes from the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1903, and also the creation of the Food and Drug Administration. So the bureaucratic element that is going to regulate food and drug production and sale in the United States. And then the third thing that was part of the square deal was conservation of natural resources. By today's standards, what was going on at the turn of the century was horrific. Companies just dumped chemicals into rivers. You had the large publishing empires like the Hearst Company buying hundreds of thousands of acres of forest at a time just simply to clear cut in order to be able to have the resource to make paper. You saw that there was no regulation in terms of air quality. And so there was a need to certainly do something about these problems. Also, there was a rise of species becoming endangered, if not extinct, particularly birds. There were a lot of feathers as a part of fashion, and you had bird populations being decimated because of fashion. You also had, by 1900, essentially the eradication of the buffalo, except for, a few places in the wild and zoos. So there was a need to do something. And there were two views. There was the view that companies, this is part of modernity, they can do as they wish. And then people like John Muir, who was an environmentalist living out in California, had been a part of preserving and maintaining the national park out there. And he believed that it should just be untouched by man, that there should just be land set aside that nobody could be able to utilize. TR wanted to find a middle space. He said there is land that, especially for its beauty, its location, we should set it aside. And more than 125 million acres were set aside for the purposes of national parks and many others added to that over time. But he also said there is land that the government should sell or should lease for mineral rights, that it's a way in which monies can be gained, that also irrigation was a real issue. If people were going to live out in the West in larger numbers, they had to do something about the incredible annual flooding for things like the Colorado River that were destructive, but also, as you remember from an earlier lesson, anything west of the 100th meridian, if it's not on the Pacific coast, you're lucky if you're getting anywhere between 2 and 5 inches of annual rainfall. So there were fights over water amongst farmers, between states. And so the idea between the Newlands Act was that you would have land that could be sold. That money then would be repurposed for irrigation in the West. It's what eventually will help create the Hoover Dam, with the Colorado River, and make it possible for people to live in the millions in places like California today. The greatest challenge that TR probably faced was the Panic of 1907. And in 1907, there was a banking crisis. And there was an expectation sort of that every 15 to 20 years you'd have a panic in the market. And it would last anywhere from 6 to 18 months. We see it in 1819, 1837, 1857, 1873, 1893. But the Panic of 1893 was quite prolonged. It took 4 years to see a return to economic growth, unemployment under 10%. And so, just a decade later, to have yet another panic, and this one amongst its financial institutions, was quite unnerving. And TR was a very smart man. He was an autodidact. He would be interested in the subject and study to the point that he could write a book and gain expertise. He did that for much of his writing career. But he understood that there were limits in terms of banking. He also didn't trust that Congress could create a monetary policy or do something that would actually solve the problems that you had in 1907. You had dozens of banks that had literally closed their doors and their depositors couldn't get their cash out because they had overextended themselves in terms of loans. So who to go to? Who's got the expertise? Well, it turns out to be JP Morgan. But TR's already run afoul of JP Morgan, but they were social with one another. They'd known each other long before TR was president. And he did go to him saying that if there's any person who can solve this problem, it was probably Morgan. Morgan, if you remember, had back in the mid 1890s loaned about $5 million of his own personal cash of gold, plus arranged millions of other dollars in loans for gold from European banks for the US government. So his acumen in terms of finance and certainly his own personal wealth probably best suited him to this task. But he did something that we've seen in modern times. Something quite similar happened in 2008 with the banking crisis, but this time it was being handled through the Federal Reserve, which didn't exist in 1907. JP Morgan brings in the heads of these banks and says, let me see your books. Let's figure out who's too big to fail. And these smaller banks, if you've been incredibly mismanaged, I'll take you over. And your customers will become my customers, and they'll be able to have cash on Monday morning. For these larger banks that have a much greater market share of depositors, anywhere from about 3 to 7% of the American public, well, we've got to keep them going. And he infused them with cash. They essentially got a loan so that their depositors could come and take out cash as they needed it. But within a couple of weeks, he had personally solved this banking crisis, which was wonderful. But it also demonstrated that perhaps there needed to be some alternative, that the current system where monetary policy and ultimately the major economic decisions in the country were being made through the legislative branch, that had to change. And we'll see that come to be during Woodrow Wilson's administration. But JP Morgan also needs something for himself. He's done good for the country, but he wants to further expand the US Steel. But to do that, he needs to buy a company, one that is struggling, probably because of some of the predatory practices of US Steel. But he wants to buy Tennessee Coal and Iron, but realizes and says to TR, I can't do that because I've already been prosecuted for these practices with OneTrust. And so, why would I go through this again? And TR says, you won't be prosecuted. Continue to expand and build your empire of steel. And there's a lot of pushback on TR, even from his fellow Republicans about this. And he begins to speak about this idea that there are good trusts and bad trusts. And we can see our cartoonist having a little fun here with not only TR's ability to be a hunter, and that story I told you about the baby bears earlier in our show, but also that it can't be up to the president to decide which companies have practices that, although might be immoral, if not illegal, can stay in business, but others will be prosecuted. So it was not a legitimate standpoint, but it was one that served JP Morgan very well. So my picture here is of William Howard Taft, who was the largest president we've had to date. He was well over 6'5". He weighed more than 300 pounds. There's legend that he got stuck in the White House bathtub. I don't know how true that is, although a custom bathtub was made for him because of his enormous size. And so we have a little pun here, but he was the bigger trust buster. So he had been vice president to TR. And after 2 terms, TR could have kept serving if he wanted to, but he decided to go into sort of semi-retirement, and his vice president Taft took over. Taft was a gifted lawyer. He'd been governor of Ohio. He had hoped with his support with the Republican Party, he would eventually become a Supreme Court justice, which he does after the presidency. But as president, he decided that he would continue to pursue the trust busting that had been part of the Square deal. But by 1912, one of the biggest critics of this administration will actually be Theodore Roosevelt himself. He'll complain that there's not enough support for conservation, and that Taft believed in tariffs and was continuing to agree that Congress could raise tariffs. And again, that was seen as something that ultimately protected American business, especially big business. So Taft, after one term, finds himself not being a president who's an incumbent and having a pretty easy attempt to seek office again. He now faces his old boss, who decides to create a third party because he can't get the nomination from the Republican Party himself. And so we have a little math here, but you can see my elephant representing Taft, this bull moose party with its little pince nez, which is TR. And that will end up dividing the Republican Party. And as a result, we will see a Democrat, Woodrow Wilson, take the White House in 1912. And besides Grover Cleveland, we had not had a Democratic president between 1860 and 1912. So the Republicans had dominated in national office. And it will be because of this quixotic bid for a third term that Theodore Roosevelt really derails it for the Republican Party. So Woodrow Wilson was a college professor. He had been president of Princeton University and also governor of New Jersey, and was a progressive. And as a progressive, he felt that TR and Taft had made good incremental steps, but they had not done enough. And he spoke about the triple wall of privilege, right? We use that word privilege today to mean that which the elites have, assume is their right, but gives them some benefit that others do not have. He said there's three areas where there needs to be legislation, if not simply changes to the Constitution, even if possible. The first one was tariffs. They need to be reduced. You can't be breaking up monopolies on one hand, but keeping tariffs high. That the message has to be across the board that there needs to be more competition in the market and competitive pricing. With banking, we will finally get the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. And again, that was something that people had been talking about and working on since the banking crisis of 1907. But now having a public-private entity working together to help control the money supply, and also making sure that banking practices amongst its member banks were far better and regulated. The Federal Reserve will do that. And then we'll also see really the true end to the trusts and the end to the monopolization that had existed in the Gilded Age was something called the Clayton Antitrust Act. Unlike the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, the Clayton Act is going to protect unions. It's going to say that all of the following are monopolistic practices that can be prosecuted under the law, except what unions do. That their monopoly on labor will not be prosecuted, therefore they can protest, they can strike. It will also say that you can't have shell companies. So what a lot of these monopolies had done is created a shell company, this trust, which all the other companies own shares of stock in. Therefore, these companies own shares of stock in these other companies. And essentially, you had a few companies ultimately invested in one another to prevent other people from entering the market. He also will encourage Congress to pass, again, legislation to create some bureaucratic institution that is going to be the enforcement of this Clayton Antitrust Act, and that will be the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC. And what they're really going to do in the 20th century and 21st century in terms of monopolization is not necessarily break up monopolies. They'll do quite a bit of that in the early part, but over time, it will be about preventing monopolization. So stopping companies from purchasing other companies for what will end up becoming too much control of the market share and therefore precluding competition. So the next thing we're going to look at is what will be the reform that happens at the municipal and state level. And you may not think today, that these seem like great municipal projects. We've got a horse-drawn trolley system here. And we also have, this was part of the aqueduct system in New York City, but what made it possible to bring in store fresh, palatable water for the homes of people living in the city. But those projects cost hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. And as we saw with Boss Tweed, certainly Lincoln Steffen's expose on the Philadelphia political machine run by the Republican Party, you had too many elected officials who had access to money, were able to take bribes, kickbacks, and ultimately were not good stewards of the people's taxes. And so there will be a push in the early 20th century to make lawmaking more democratic, allow the people to have some kind of role in lawmaking. That's what an initiative is, and not all states have it. But where you have an initiative, you get people proposing a law, they get enough signatures in order to put it on the ballot, and then a vote. A referendum is when you have an elected political body like a state legislature. They create a law, but instead of sending it to the governor immediately to become a law, this bill goes on again the ballot and it's voted on by the people. In the 20th, 21st century, often very controversial subjects, whether it should be a lottery, legalization of marijuana, gay rights for much of the 1990s and early aughts ended up being referendums in many states. And then recall, which again exists in very few places, mostly out in the Western states, but it is when you hold an election to decide whether you're going to keep your current governor. And so you would have, let's say, a governor who gets elected and a year into a 4-year term, there are things that aren't going right, that's problematic with the administration, or maybe there's been allegations of corruption. You get enough signatures and you can put this as a ballot measure that people can vote on. If you vote to recall the governor, then you're going to have to start all over again with a primary and a general election. But initiative, referendum, and recall are really the greatest ways that we're going to see the average American, especially at the state level, be able to be involved in lawmaking and also being able to have greater control over their elected officials. Also, starting in the early 20th century, the political gifts that had been acceptable. I mean, you had coal barons, providing free coal to elected politicians, rail passes for members of Congress and their family members. All of this becomes bribery. You can't do it anymore. You're going to see direct election of senators with the 17th Amendment. And you're also going to see the rise of city managers, in much the same way that there's going to be a public outcry about worker safety after the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911. A little earlier than that, in 1900, there had been a devastating flood in Galveston, Texas. And it should never have happened because millions of dollars had been spent on levees and other ways of preventing flooding. And thousands of people died, 10,000 people lost their homes. And when it was all said and done, the levees and the other structures that had been built were poorly designed, that the money that had been set aside for their building, most of it had been stolen. And so you had, unqualified people doing the building. Ultimately, it was a failed public works project that should not have failed. And so Galveston will be the first city, but then you'll see cities across the country begin to create this idea of the city manager. And you'll have states that will say that you cannot have elected officials like the mayor and the city council having direct control of finances, that you're going to hire essentially a third party under contract to do that and pay them well so there's no temptation to steal. And then again, this idea of the federal government intervening into water rights, which was a big issue in the West. And until that could be resolved, you weren't going to see large numbers of people settling in the West as you do after World War II. So the ideas of recall, initiative, and referendum had existed in some states beforehand, but certainly recall and initiative, they're often referred to as the Wisconsin idea because this man, Robert La Follette, was from Wisconsin. He'd been a governor and a congressman and a senator of that state. And his progressive campaign was to let the people have greater power, make it more democratic in terms of lawmaking and also selecting who represents them. So the idea of the direct primary that we embrace today did not exist in most places prior to the 1920s. The party bosses told you who was going to be the candidate for mayor, the candidate for governor for your party, or even the presidency. There were power brokers who'd sit in a room for days on end deciding who they could vote, they could all agree on, but the people had to accept their choice. Direct primaries are going to upend the power of the political machine significantly. And you can see here, La Follette, on his campaign, he wanted to see recall even at the national level. Since we actually have impeachment for people like members of the Supreme Court, federal judges, and the presidency, we probably didn't need to go that far and never have. The last thing I want you to think about is the fact that when we look in history at a group of people, an individual, ideas, it's important to take the good with the bad, that we have to understand that you can have lots of good ideas and also some bad ideas, or ones that over time will become critical. So for immigration, we will see by 1924 that there will be something called the National Origins Act that will greatly reduce immigration, especially that from Central and Eastern Europe, Russia to a trickle, for more than 40 years. But for many of the progressives, they loved that they were changing laws, that they loved that the work of Jacob Riis was reforming, housing quality and public water systems in cities like New York. They loved the fact that they were getting rid of child labor. But they also believed that the problems that came with, this urbanization with immigrants, that unemployment, they blamed alcoholism being on the rise because of Catholic immigrants, although there were plenty of Protestants born in this country who were drinking at that time too. But their understanding was one that there had to be assimilation by immigrants. And we can see that with the Jane Addamses and the Jacob Rieses of the day. But they will also call for limiting immigration, that they believe that some of the problems that exist are not simply things that can be solved with laws if immigrants continue to come en masse. The vast majority of progressives were also eugenicists, and lots of intellectuals were, really up until the 1940s. But eugenics is the science where ultimately you believe that human beings, like animals and plants, that there's good genes and bad genes, and you want to encourage people with good genes to keep reproducing and those with bad genes to stop, and might be willing to do so in ways that by today's standards would be unconscionable, but there will be a full movement towards legal sterilization. Sometimes that will be of people who've committed crimes, especially if they were seen as a sexual in nature. But other times it could be simply that someone was deemed to be what they would have called an imbecile or mentally retarded, meaning that they had a relatively low IQ or they were perceived to have a cognitive disability and were sterilized. And there were states that allowed this to continue on well into the 1970s. The Carnegie Foundation, which was part of the philanthropic endeavors of Andrew Carnegie, which included founding universities and scholarship programs, and forming libraries across the country, also gave money to sterilize people who were seen as unfit. And so the nativist movement that we saw in an earlier time lives on, and many of its proponents are people who also were these progressives looking to reform business and make other improvements in American life. So understand that the ideas that we may like and the people who espouse them, they may also have some ideas that perhaps deserve some criticism as well. Um, to kind of recap and end this out, we need to make sure that we realize the big reforms that are happening to national government in that time. The 16th Amendment, which is going to be individual income tax. And again, when it was passed in 1912, when we ratified the Constitution, it was on the top 3% of income. So it was the Carnegies and the Rockefellers and their children who would be paying this stuff. The system we have today, which encourage basically is almost all Americans who make an income beyond a certain level, is not the system that was originally created. But again, to kind of create a redistributive model with taxation. The Federal Reserve in 1913, the 17th Amendment, direct election of senators. So now the states and these corporations that control these monopolies in a state, they no longer decide how half of Congress is representing the people, which it wasn't. It was representing their interests. Now the people are directly being able to control that house as well. And then we're also going to see that the 19th Amendment, right? Women's suffrage in 1920, and that really is seen as the capstone to the end of this era, because with the 19th Amendment, at least on paper, all adults in this country can vote. But as we will see, and certainly if you continue on with our other 6.9 lecture about the failures and limits of progressivism, we will see that still there are whole groups of Americans who are not being served in the progressive era. So as we close out, we want to think about to what extent were progressive era reformers and the federal government effective in bringing about reform at the national level. So the excesses of the Gilded Age, the problems that arise during the period from 1865 to 1900, what exactly did the progressives do in order to create lasting reforms in those areas? And then also, for all their successes, what would be the limitations of these efforts in the first 20 years of the 20th century?